Arman sat motionless beside the hospital bed, his fingers loosely wrapped around Sanaa's cold hand as if letting go for even a second might somehow make her disappear forever, the soft, repetitive beeping of the heart monitor echoing in the sterile room like a cruel reminder that life could hang by a fragile thread, and for the past 3 days, that thread had been all he had left. He hadn't slept properly, hadn't eaten more than a few bites, hadn't even stepped outside except when the nurses insisted, because every time he looked at Sanaa's pale face, he felt a crushing guilt settle deeper into his chest, the kind that whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had missed something, some warning sign, some moment when she needed him more and he had been too busy chasing deadlines, meetings, and the endless grind of providing a better life for them, and now here she was, silent, unmoving, lost somewhere between consciousness and oblivion, while he sat there powerless, wishing he could trade places with her just to end this unbearable helplessness. The doctors had explained her condition in complicated medical terms, something about stress, sudden collapse, and the need for absolute rest. But none of it mattered to Arman because all he could see was the woman he loved lying there without opening her eyes, without saying his name, without even squeezing his hand back. And it terrified him more than anything he had ever faced before, more than business losses, more than failures, more than the fear of not being enough, because this wasn't something he could fix with effort or money or determination. This was something completely out of his control, and that realization gnawed at him every second he remained in that room. He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to her even though he wasn't sure she could hear him, telling her about the small things, the normal things, the kind of everyday moments they used to share, like how the neighbor's dog wouldn't stop barking or how he had burned toast that morning because he was too distracted thinking about her, clinging to the hope that somewhere deep inside, she might still be listening, might still be fighting to come back to him, because the alternative was something he refused to accept, something too dark to even let cross his mind. Just as he adjusted the blanket over her, his phone buzzed sharply against the quiet of the room, the sudden sound making him flinch, and for a moment he considered ignoring it because nothing seemed more important than staying right where he was, but the vibration continued insistently, dragging his attention away, and with a reluctant sigh, he pulled the phone from his pocket, glancing at the unfamiliar number on the screen before answering in a low voice, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness around him. "Hello," he said, his tone tired, almost distant, and on the other end, a calm, professional voice responded, "Hello, I speaking with Mr. Arman," and he straightened slightly, instinctively alert despite his exhaustion. "Yes, speaking," he replied, his eyes drifting back to Sanaa's face as if to reassure himself she was still there, still breathing, still real. "Sir, I'm calling from your bank," the voice continued politely. "We just wanted to confirm a transaction that was made today," and Arman frowned, confusion flickering across his face because the timing felt completely wrong. "What transaction?" he asked, his grip tightening slightly on the phone, and there was a brief pause before the caller spoke again. "A large withdrawal from your joint account, sir, initiated by your wife," and for a moment, Arman thought he had misheard, the words not quite registering as reality. "That's not possible," he said slowly, his gaze locking onto Sanaa's motionless form. "My wife is in the hospital." And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before, stretching uncomfortably as if the person on the other end was trying to process his response, and then the voice returned, less certain now. "Sir, I understand your concern, but she is physically present here at the branch," and Arman felt a cold wave wash over him, a creeping unease that started in his chest and spread outward. "No," he whispered, almost to himself, "you must be mistaken," but the voice continued, more firmly this time. "Sir, she is here, and she is not alone," and Arman's heart began to pound, each beat louder than the last, drowning out the steady rhythm of the machines around him. "What do you mean she's not alone?" he asked, his voice tightening, and the answer that came next shattered whatever fragile sense of reality he had been holding onto. "She's with a man, sir, a man who looks exactly like you." And everything seemed to stop in that instant, the room, the sound, even his own breathing, as if the world itself had paused to let those words sink in, and Arman slowly turned his head, his eyes moving from the phone in his hand back to Sanaa lying on the bed, unchanged, unmoving, exactly where she had been for the past 3 days, and yet somehow, impossibly, according to the voice on the phone, she was somewhere else entirely, standing, walking, speaking, withdrawing money, with someone who shared his face. His identity, his existence, and the contradiction was so overwhelming that his mind struggled to make sense of it, to find any logical explanation that could bridge the gap between what he was seeing and what he was being told, but there was nothing, no explanation that didn't sound insane. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, a different kind of fear took hold of him, not the fear of losing Sanaa, but the fear that everything he thought he knew, everything he believed to be true, might be nothing more than an illusion carefully constructed around him. And as he stood there, caught between the silent figure on the bed and the impossible reality described over the phone, one thought echoed louder than all the rest, refusing to be ignored. If Sanaa was truly lying here in front of him, then who, or what, was at the bank pretending to be her, and why did it feel like the answer was going to destroy everything he had left? Arman didn't remember how he got out of the hospital, only that one moment he was standing beside Sanaa's motionless body and the next he was in his car gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mind racing faster than the traffic around him, replaying the bank employee's words again and again as if repetition might somehow make them less impossible, but it didn't. If anything, it made them worse, sharper, more real, because no matter how hard he tried to deny it, the image had already begun forming in his mind, Sanaa standing somewhere else, awake, alive, smiling even, and beside her a man who wore his face like it belonged to him. And the thought twisted something deep inside his chest, something that felt dangerously close to breaking. The drive felt endless even though it was only minutes, every red light an insult, every second stretching into an unbearable delay as his thoughts spiraled between anger, confusion, and a quiet, creeping dread that whispered that whatever he was about to see would change everything. And when he finally reached the bank, he didn't pause, didn't think, he stepped out of the car and walked straight inside, his heartbeat thundering in his ears so loudly it almost drowned out the noise of the crowd. And for a brief moment, everything seemed normal, people standing in lines, clerks behind counters, the low hum of routine life continuing as if nothing extraordinary was happening. But then his eyes began scanning the room, searching, desperate, until suddenly they locked onto a figure near the far counter and his entire world seemed to tilt. There she was, Sanaa, standing upright, her posture relaxed, her hair perfectly in place, her face glowing with a health that was completely impossible compared to the pale, lifeless version he had left behind in the hospital room. And for a split second, Arman's mind rejected it outright, insisting this had to be a hallucination, a cruel trick born from exhaustion and stress. But then she moved, turned slightly, and smiled at the man beside her, and that's when Arman saw him, really saw him, and the air seemed to leave his lungs all at once, because the man standing there wasn't just similar to him, he was identical, same height, same build, same face down to the smallest detail, as if someone had taken Arman and copied him perfectly. And the sight was so surreal, so deeply unsettling, that Arman felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak. Caught in a moment that made no sense, before he could gather himself, a bank manager approached him cautiously, recognizing the confusion written all over his face. "Sir, are you Mr. Arman?" he asked, glancing nervously between him and the other man, and Arman nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the scene ahead. Then, "I think you should come with me," the manager said, lowering his voice, "because we're not sure what's going on either." And those words only added to the growing chaos in Arman's mind as he took a step forward, then another, each movement heavy, deliberate, as if he was walking toward something he couldn't escape. And as he got closer, Sanaa noticed him, her expression shifting instantly, the easy smile vanishing as shock spread across her face, her eyes widening in a way that confirmed one thing beyond doubt. She recognized him, she knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, she hadn't expected him to be there. "Arman," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, and hearing her say his name while standing there perfectly fine, sent a sharp jolt through him, a mix of relief and rage that collided violently inside his chest. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low but firm, his gaze flicking between her and the man beside her, and for a moment, neither of them answered, the silence stretching tight until the other man finally stepped forward with an unsettling calmness, his expression almost amused. "I guess the timing wasn't ideal," he said casually, his voice mirroring Arman's so closely it was almost unbearable to hear, "but I suppose it was inevitable." And Arman's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" he asked, each word laced with tension, and the man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question before responding with a faint smirk. "That's a complicated answer," he said, "but the simple version is, I'm the man she chose, and the words hit like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of Arman as he stared at Sanaa, searching her face for denial, for anger, for anything that would prove this was some kind of misunderstanding, but instead he saw guilt, clear and undeniable, written in every line of her expression, and it was that look, more than anything else, that shattered the last piece of hope he had been holding onto. You lied to me, he said quietly, the realization settling in with a cold, heavy weight. The hospital, the illness, it was all fake, and Sanaa's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it, didn't even try, which somehow made it worse, because her silence confirmed everything he feared, every suspicion that had begun to form the moment he received that call, and suddenly all the pieces began to fall into place, the sudden collapse, the rushed hospital admission, the strict instructions from the doctors, the limited access. It had all been part of a carefully constructed plan designed to keep him distracted, to keep him exactly where they wanted him while they executed whatever this was, and the realization sent a surge of anger through him so intense it almost broke through his control, but he held it back, forcing himself to remain still, to observe, because deep down he knew that reacting now, losing control in this moment, would only give them what they wanted. The bank manager cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to maintain professionalism despite the bizarre situation unfolding in front of him. Sir, we just need confirmation on the withdrawal, he said, gesturing toward the documents on the counter. And Arman glanced at them briefly before looking back at Sanaa. Go ahead, he said, his voice suddenly calm in a way that surprised even himself, and both Sanaa and the other man looked at him with confusion, clearly not expecting that response. You're not going to stop this? Sanaa asked hesitantly, her brows furrowing as if she couldn't quite understand his reaction, and Arman shook his head slightly, a faint, unreadable smile forming on his lips. Why would I? He replied. It's your decision, isn't it? And the uncertainty in her eyes deepened, but after a moment, she turned back to the counter, picking up the pen with slightly trembling hands as she began signing the documents. And Arman watched silently, his gaze steady, his mind already moving beyond the shock, beyond the betrayal, into something colder, something more calculated. Because in that moment, as painful as it was, he understood something crucial. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was about deception on a level he hadn't imagined possible. And if they were capable of orchestrating something this elaborate, then reacting emotionally would only put him at a disadvantage. So instead, he chose something else, something they wouldn't expect. He chose patience. The man beside Sanaa glanced at Arman one last time, his smirk returning as if he believed he had already won, as if this entire situation was nothing more than a victory already secured, and maybe, in that moment, it looked that way, because Sanaa finished signing, the documents were processed, and within minutes, they turned and walked away together, leaving Arman standing there in the middle of the bank, surrounded by the quiet murmur of strangers who had no idea they had just witnessed the collapse of someone's entire reality. And yet, despite everything, despite the betrayal, the lies, the impossible situation he had just faced, Arman didn't chase them, didn't call out, didn't even move, because deep inside, something had shifted, something had hardened, and as he finally turned away from the counter, one thought settled firmly in his mind. This wasn't the end of the story, not even close, because if they believed they had outplayed him, if they thought this was their victory, then they had made a mistake, a very serious one, and soon enough, they were going to realize exactly who they had been dealing with all along. Arman stood in the middle of the bank long after Sanaa and the man who wore his face had walked out, the glass doors closing behind them with a quiet finality that seemed to echo louder than anything else in the room. Yet he didn't move, didn't react, didn't let the storm raging inside him show even the slightest crack on his expression, because in that moment something inside him had shifted in a way he himself barely understood. The pain was still there, sharp and suffocating, the betrayal cutting deeper with every passing second as the reality replayed in his mind, her standing there healthy while he had been sitting beside a hospital bed believing she might die, her signing away their shared money without hesitation, her choosing another man, not just any man but someone who looked exactly like him, as if even his identity could be replaced, and for a brief, dangerous moment, anger surged so powerfully through him that it almost pushed him to run after them, to demand answers, to drag the truth out into the open no matter how ugly it was. But he stopped himself because deep down he realized something critical. Reacting now would only give them control. It would make him predictable, emotional, weak in their eyes, and that was exactly what they were expecting, exactly what their entire plan had been built around. So instead he took a slow breath, forcing the chaos inside him into something quieter, something colder, something far more dangerous than anger, because it was controlled. As he finally stepped out of the bank, the sunlight hit his face, but he barely noticed, his mind already racing ahead, connecting dots that had seemed meaningless before but now formed a clear, unsettling pattern. The sudden illness, the rushed hospital admission, the restricted access, the conveniently timed bank visit. It wasn't just betrayal, it was strategy, a carefully planned deception designed to keep him distracted while they executed their move, and that realization changed everything because it meant this wasn't impulsive, this wasn't a mistake, this was intentional, calculated, and that meant he needed to respond the same way. Not with emotion but with precision. He got into his car and sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead as he pulled out his phone and began checking his accounts, his business records, every financial detail he could access, and as he scrolled through the information, a faint, almost ironic smile appeared on his lips because what they thought was a victory had already been neutralized long before this day, weeks ago, when he had first noticed small inconsistencies, subtle changes in Sanaa's behavior that didn't quite make sense at the time but had been enough to plant a seed of doubt in his mind, a seed he hadn't fully acknowledged back then but had acted on instinctively, quietly. Without confrontation, without accusation, he had begun restructuring things, transferring assets, securing accounts, putting legal protections in place, not because he knew exactly what was coming but because something in him had warned him that things were not as stable as they seemed. And now, sitting there in the aftermath of their carefully executed betrayal, he realized just how important those quiet decisions had been. The joint account they had emptied, the one they believed held everything, was no longer what it used to be. Most of the real funds had already been moved into separate, protected channels under his sole control. The business they thought they could touch was legally structured in a way that prevented unauthorized claims. The property they assumed was still jointly owned had been transferred into a trust that safeguarded it from exactly this kind of situation, and the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that while they had been planning their move, he had unknowingly been preparing for it, and the balance of power was not what they believed it to be. Arman started the car and drove away, not toward the hospital, not toward home, but toward his office, because if there was one thing he understood now, it was that this situation required clarity, documentation, and control. And as he entered his office, the familiar environment grounded him, allowing him to focus as he began making calls, contacting his lawyer, his financial advisor, quietly initiating steps that would ensure everything remained exactly where it needed to be, out of reach, untouchable. And throughout it all, he maintained the same calm, measured tone, revealing nothing of the storm that had brought him here, because this was no longer about confrontation, it was about outcome. Hours passed, and by the time he finally returned to the hospital, the room looked exactly as he had left it, Sanaa lying on the bed, still, silent, the illusion intact for anyone who didn't know the truth. And for a moment, he stood at the doorway watching, a strange mix of emotions passing through him, not grief this time, not even anger, but something closer to acceptance, because the woman lying there was no longer the person he thought she was, the version of her he had loved, trusted, built his life around. That version had already disappeared long before today, replaced by someone capable of orchestrating a deception this elaborate, this cold, and acknowledging that truth, as painful as it was, also freed him in a way he hadn't expected. He stepped inside and sat down beside the bed once more, his expression calm as he looked at her face, the same face that had smiled at another man just hours ago, and for a brief second, he wondered if there had ever been a moment when it was real, when the love they shared hadn't been leading to this. But the thought faded quickly because it no longer mattered. What mattered now was what came next, and as he sat there, he made a decision, not out of anger, not out of a desire to hurt her back, but out of a quiet, unwavering resolve to protect himself, to ensure that whatever game she thought she was playing, he would be the one who determined how it ended. The next few days passed with an eerie normalcy, Arman continuing to visit the hospital, maintaining the appearance of a concerned husband while behind the scenes everything was being secured, finalized, locked into place, and he didn't contact Sanaa, didn't confront her, didn't give her any indication that he knew the full extent of what had happened, because silence, he realized, was far more powerful than any accusation. It left her uncertain, left her guessing, and in that uncertainty, she would make mistakes. And sure enough, as time went on, small signs began to appear. Attempts to access accounts that were no longer available, inquiries that led nowhere, subtle cracks in the illusion she had created, and each one confirmed what Arman already knew, that their plan had not gone as smoothly as they believed, and through it all, he remained patient, composed, allowing the situation to unfold exactly as it needed to, because the truth was, the moment he had chosen not to react in that bank, the moment he had smiled instead of breaking, that was the moment everything had shifted in his favor. They just didn't know it yet, and as he sat there once again beside the silent figure on the hospital bed, he realized something else, something almost ironic, that the greatest advantage he had in this entire situation was the fact that they underestimated him. They believed he was blinded by love, weakened by emotion, too broken to think clearly, and that belief had given him the space to act without interference, to prepare without resistance, and ultimately, to turn their carefully planned betrayal into the very thing that would expose them, dismantle their illusion, and leave them facing the consequences of a game they thought they had already won. 2 weeks passed with a quiet precision that only Arman understood, every move he made deliberate, every silence intentional, and by the time the illusion finally began to collapse, he was no longer the man who had stood frozen in that bank. He was composed, steady, and entirely in control of the outcome that was about to unfold, and it began exactly as he expected, not with confrontation but with desperation, because people who believe they've won rarely prepare for loss, and when it comes, it hits them harder than anything else. That evening, as Arman sat in his living room reviewing documents with a calm focus, there was a sudden, frantic knock on the door, sharp and uneven, carrying a sense of urgency that made it clear whoever stood outside was no longer confident, no longer in control. And Arman didn't rush to answer. He took his time, placing the papers neatly aside before walking toward the door with measured steps, and when he finally opened it, he found Sanaa standing there. But she was nothing like the woman he had seen at the bank, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes red and swollen as if she hadn't slept, her expression no longer confident but shattered, almost unrecognizable from the version of her that had walked away so easily, and for a brief moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence thick with everything that had happened between them, until she finally spoke, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and urgency. "Arman, we need to talk," and he looked at her calmly, his expression unreadable, before stepping aside just enough to allow her to enter, not out of kindness but out of closure. Because he knew this moment had been coming and he intended to see it through to the end. She walked inside quickly, glancing around as if searching for something familiar, something stable to hold onto. But the atmosphere itself felt different, colder, more distant, as though the home they once shared no longer recognized her presence, and she turned back to him, her composure cracking further as the words rushed out. "The money is gone," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "The accounts, they're frozen, I can't access anything. The documents we signed, they're being rejected, nothing is working," and Arman listened without interruption, his gaze steady, almost detached, as if he had already processed this moment long before it arrived. "Yes," he replied simply, "I know," and his calmness seemed to unsettle her even more, her confusion mixing with panic as she took a step closer. "What do you mean you know?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "What did you do?" And for the first time since she had entered, Arman allowed a faint expression to cross his face, not anger, not satisfaction, but something quieter, something rooted in truth. "I protected myself," he said, his tone even, and the simplicity of his answer seemed to hit her harder than any accusation could have, because it left no room for argument, no space to twist the narrative into something else. It was a statement of fact, clear and undeniable. She shook her head, struggling to process it. "No, that's not possible," she insisted, her voice unsteady. "We checked everything, it was all there," and Arman tilted his head slightly. "Was it?" he asked, and the question lingered between them, forcing her to confront the possibility that what she believed she had secured was never truly hers to take, that the victory she thought she had achieved had been nothing more than an illusion, and as that realization began to sink in, her posture shifted, her confidence collapsing entirely as she whispered, "He left." And those two words carried more weight than anything else she had said, revealing the final piece of the truth without needing further explanation. The man who looked like Arman, the man she had chosen, the man she believed was her escape, was gone, vanished just as quickly as he had appeared. leaving her alone to face the consequences of the choices she had made, and for a moment, Arman felt something stir within him, not sympathy exactly, but a recognition of how completely her plan had unraveled, how the person she had trusted had abandoned her the moment things stopped going according to plan, but even that feeling faded quickly, replaced by the quiet certainty that this outcome was not his responsibility. "You tricked me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes searching his face for some sign of the man she once knew, the man who would have done anything for her, and Arman shook his head slowly. "No," he replied, "you showed me who you really are," and the truth of those words settled heavily in the room, leaving no space for denial, no escape from the reality she now had to face, and as tears filled her eyes, she took another step toward him, her voice breaking as she spoke again. "I made a mistake, Arman, please. I didn't think it would go this far," and there it was, the apology, the regret, arriving only after everything had fallen apart, only after she had lost the advantage she believed she had, and Arman listened. But this time there was no internal conflict, no hesitation, because the clarity he had gained over the past 2 weeks had erased any illusion he once held. "A mistake," he repeated quietly. "You planned this, Sanaa, you built it step by step, the hospital, the lies, the account, that wasn't a mistake, that was a choice," and each word landed with a calm finality that made it impossible to argue against, and she lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes, because deep down she knew he was right. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching as the weight of everything settled into place, and then Arman took a small step back, creating a distance between them that felt larger than the space itself, a distance that marked the end of something that could never be rebuilt, and he moved toward the door, opening it slowly as he looked at her one last time, his expression steady, resolved. "I didn't take revenge," he said quietly, "I just stopped letting you destroy me." And those words carried a finality that left no room for hope, no possibility of reconciliation, only closure, and Sanaa stood there frozen for a moment before realizing what it meant, before understanding that this was the end, truly the end, and as she stepped toward the door, her movements slow, uncertain, she turned back once more as if hoping for something, anything, but Arman had already made his decision, and when she finally crossed the threshold, he closed the door gently but firmly behind her, the sound echoing softly through the house like the final note of a long, painful chapter coming to an end. Outside, Sanaa's composure broke completely, her knees giving way as she collapsed onto the ground, the reality of her situation crashing down all at once, the loss of the man she had chosen, the loss of the life she had betrayed, the loss of the control she thought she had secured, and inside, Arman stood still for a moment, listening to the silence that followed, a silence that no longer felt empty but peaceful, and as he turned away from the door, walking back into the quiet of his home, he realized something that made everything he had endured worth it. That true revenge wasn't about causing pain, it wasn't about making someone suffer the way they made you suffer, it was about reclaiming yourself, your dignity, your peace, and refusing to let someone else's betrayal define your future, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Arman allowed himself to breathe without the weight of doubt or fear pressing down on him, because he knew that while she had tried to break him, to replace him, to erase everything they had built, she had ultimately failed, not because he fought back with anger, but because he chose something stronger. Something quieter, something far more powerful. He chose to rise, and in doing so, he left her behind, exactly where her choices had led her, while he moved forward into a future that was finally, completely his own.